Lilli Kulak has been a senior data analyst at GrubHub for over a year now. She received her bachelor's degree in mathematics and economics from Northeastern University. She previously worked at LevelUp, a platform that creates personalized guest experiences for restaurants, which was then acquired by GrubHub in 2018. Lilli, given your background, you probably loved school.
Yeah,
I feel like it's
I
like
thrive.
people who do well in like the math and sciences, and then people
Yeah.
who hate school.
Yeah. It was just good, there was like constant positive reinforcement, and then I go into the real world where you just do a job and that's it. And I was like, oh no.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to Without a Roadmap, the podcast for product folks who don't have all the answers. My name is Jonas, joined here by my co-host Cameron and a very special guest, Lilli Kulak. So great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Lilli, we're so excited to have you. I think you are the first person with the title data analyst on the podcast. So you're representing and speaking for all data analysts out there. Yes. No pressure whatsoever.
Unequivocal representation, yes. Cool. Authority.
Right, exactly. I think to start, we should just go over kind of what that role is in the broad sense, and maybe make it more confined to your experience being a data analyst since you graduated from Northeastern, just to kind of give our audience and everybody listening out there more info on what a data analyst role particularly is. I myself haven't worked with one particularly in my career, so I'm interested to learn more about that as well. So why don't you go ahead and kick it off with that?
Yeah, definitely. So I think data analyst kind of means a lot of different things in different organizations, and even different teams. Data analyst means something different. So for me, it has been a combination of reporting and sort of strategic analysis. So I act basically as a shared resource for a lot of our strategic teams, sales, marketing, really providing them with insights as to how the business is going, and basically fulfilling their data needs. And I also work in a finance sort of centered team. So that involves a lot of reporting for publishing metrics, publishing for quarterly financial stuff like that. And my job as a data person is really to dig into the platform in that case. And since we're kind of a financial product, you put your credit card in, there's a right. transfer of funds, right? So there's a lot to report there. And basically knowing the ins and outs of the platform and being able to extract whatever data is needed to fully report on that stuff.
Cool. That's a great summary right there. I think to bring it back a little bit more to your early days at LevelUp, which was obviously acquired by GrubHub. Talk to us a little bit about LevelUp and going through the acquisition process so early in your career.
Yeah, definitely. It was definitely it was exciting and a little scary when we got the news that we were being acquired, because I had just started full time, so I wasn't really anticipating it. And we had been growing really rapidly, and there was a lot of excitement around the product, and this was sort of a turn that I personally wasn't expecting, because we hadn't done delivery before. We hadn't been focusing on delivery, so I was like, oh, GrubHub, that's that's different. And the first thing was that it was just a much bigger, much more visible organization. Being in a tiny company, you can and you really have to do things on the fly and, just make it work wherever you can. I feel with a bigger public company, especially, you're really visible, and there's a lot of kind of formalized requirements for financial reporting specifically. So there were a number of audits that we had to go through that I got to sort of provide a ton of information for, and really summarize our platform and just explain all the financial activity that had gone on with LevelUp. And then sort of just being absorbed into this larger company. And I think like our office in particular, we had a really strong culture at LevelUp. I'm sure with Parlor, like having a small company, you can really like define the culture. And I think initially people were nervous that we weren't going to be able to retain that, but our leadership was really committed to retaining it. So like we had a ton of like, we were like a really spoiled startup. Like we got like a ton of free food because we work with restaurants. So we were like, oh no, like, are we going to lose catered lunch twice a week? But we didn't. And
it's great news.
Yeah, no, it was great. And there were a bunch of benefits like having to do with the platform and stuff that were awesome. And that ended up sort of just being like migrated into the GrubHub world. We didn't end up losing any of it. And I think that was really important. And I don't think like all acquisitions necessarily have that experience. So I felt really lucky to be in a place where I had started on this small team that I loved, and I didn't want it to like change, but I still got to have this experience of moving to a bigger company with a lot more visibility and formal like financial processes, and still retain that like startup feel.
Yeah. Before we move on to, I'm sure that Jonas wants to ask the next question. Before we move on to there, can you just give us like a quick summary of what LevelUp is? I think everybody knows what GrubHub is, especially over the last year as everyone has ordered a ton of takeout. But just give us like a quick summary of what LevelUp is and how it fits into the GrubHub platform.
For sure. So LevelUp is basically like a digital punch card is like how I think of it. Like going to your favorite coffee shop or whatever, getting loyalty points, earning rewards for spending that you're already doing. So a lot of what we worked on was either building apps for companies, basically like customized apps, or we had sort of a not marketplace platform, but the LevelUp app, you could use it a ton of different places, and it was like you would earn rewards like all in the same place. We've since moved away from that and focused a lot more on building custom loyalty for different restaurants. And that's really what's been folded into the GrubHub platform. And I think that is why we were a really appealing acquisition, is because we have this really strong loyalty engine, and it just makes like retaining diners so much like more powerful when you can offer them something of value for coming back transacting with you all the time.
So aside from, you know, there being probably a couple additional zeros at the end of reports or numbers that you're pulling with transitioning from a LevelUp to a GrubHub, I'm curious if, you know, on the day-to-day, you know, a data analyst at a startup is in some ways more scrappy or works differently than a data analyst at, you know, a public company. Yeah, I think from product perspective, we, you know, completely see that there's a difference between the product manager at a startup, like startup PMs versus enterprise PMs. I'm curious if that's the same in data analysis.
Yeah, definitely. I think it sort of manifests in like a way that I wouldn't necessarily expect. Like when we were a startup, you wear a lot of hats, obviously. People cover a lot of bases with their individual position. So that really involved me being like a right-hand person for accounting and being like in the weeds of making sure our financials were accurate and like having really robust evidence for it. And like moving into this bigger company with a lot more resources, like they have a ton more accountants than we had, and they have a lot more, you know, data resources, and they have their own systems built out and everything. So I got to sort of move away from that like reporting side of things, and transition more into analysis and like strategic decisions, pulling metrics for strategic reasons rather than just for publishing data. So I think it's that like there are just a lot more resources at a big company, and you can sort of like be honed into your specialized role, which is like good and bad, right? It's sometimes it's kind of fun to be trying to do like everything in a startup,
right?
But yeah, I've definitely built different skills being in the more specialized role.
Got it. Got it. It's almost like when your company, the one that you work for, is acquired. It's kind of like you're starting a new job, right? You have
Yeah.
new teammates, you have new different products and tools you got to use internally, different like organizational processes and stuff like that. How was
Yeah.
that experience like coming into like a brand new space where like you're not the only one starting a new job, but there's like a whole previous team, and I'm sure like you had your little own internal clique still, and
Yeah.
you're trying to like find new friends in the new place. It's almost like starting school again.
Yeah, definitely. I think our experience is pretty unique because we sort of transformed the existing LevelUp Boston office into the GrubHub Boston office. So a lot of people stuck around, and we just sort of like morphed into GrubHub with like a LevelUp flair. Um, so I really like retained a lot of my clicks and like it's funny you say that because like our finance department was just like, I'm gonna end up like gushing about them so much, so embarrassing. I just like loved them. They were like really great mentors to me, and we spent a ton of time together. We all sat in the same little circle area, and like we would always eat lunch together and stuff. And I feel lucky that I got to sort of retain that because we didn't have to move offices. We didn't really have to move around. We all sort of like started to branch out into our individual, more specified roles, but we were still working in the same like physical space, and still, you know, chatting, catching up over the weekend and everything, and really like maintaining really strong relationships, I would say. So a lot of it was just sort of getting used to, you know, having like different accounting software and like a few different like querying platforms and stuff, like different ways of visualizing data that we had to get used to. And there's like a different database that like I'd become so like expert in the LevelUp database. I was like, I know everything. And then there's like this whole new like huge thing of data that was like a bear to learn, but definitely worth it because they collected data differently than we did, and like had a lot of insights that we could look into that I didn't necessarily have at LevelUp. So it was more just like learning the ropes of the way that they did things.
So I think one of the things that we can probably most closely relate to as, you know, data folks and product folks is the importance of, you know, working cross-functionally. And you mentioned that you're building reports for sales and marketing, you might interface with finance and accounting. You know, for any of the folks in those teams that are listening here, could you share any tips on, you know, the best practices for working or asking for things from somebody in your role?
Yeah, definitely. I think like with cross-functional collaboration, like communication is key. Really, with any relationship, communication is key, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think one of the things that's most helpful for me when I receive requests from people is just having like a ton of context around what the request is for. So like what the use case is, who is the audience for it, are they super technical or not? Like what kind of metrics would they benefit from seeing highlighted? Another thing is if you're coming to a data person with a request and you have like a hypothesis in mind for like what the conclusion of an analysis might be, like, oh, if we launch this part of the product, then I'm expecting a lift in this area. Definitely communicating that, not necessarily so that the data person will confirm, will find evidence for,
bias.
yeah, we'll find evidence for your conclusion, but it helps for like a gut check, I think, because if you immediately notice a trend that like is going along with the hypothesis or directly contradicting it, you can sort of like make sure you confirm that and have like as much evidence for it as possible. And yeah, I think just having an idea of like what people are looking for is always helpful. And then it's kind of like on the data person to be like completely objective and like pull evidence that's relevant. Yeah. And then another thing is specifying like level of precision that's necessary, I would say. So I say this like thinking about if you're looking at like sales or something. If you're mostly interested in like thousands of dollars and like differences in the hundreds of dollars range is like not super like significant to you, I think that that is useful to communicate, because I don't know if this is just me, but I can definitely get bogged down in finding the exact number and making sure it's like completely replicable and I know exactly where all the different parts are coming from. And that can obviously lead to like running down a huge rabbit hole of like, wait, why is this number different? And like, where is this coming from? And like, in order to focus on all of the nuances with your data that actually matter to you and actually matter to your conclusion, I think having an idea of, you can keep it at this like general range of, this order of magnitude, like having, I only really care about tens of thousands of dollars or thousands of dollars rather than like, to the penny is not necessary, stuff like that. And that definitely is like also a skill that I've kind of learned over the course of my career, in terms of like understanding materiality and like what is a relevant conclusion, what is relevant evidence for someone, and what is just sort of extraneous detail. But definitely communicating that up front is always helpful.
You mentioned before when people have their own hypothesis and they come to you and you don't want to just always confirm it and just to back their evidence. I feel like a big part of cross-functional collaboration is like handling tension really well. And I feel like that's probably a pretty good point of tension right there, is when the data comes back and it's not what they're hoping for and it kind of contradicts what they were trying to get out or move forward with. How have you handled those conversations in the past, and what do you think has been best when dealing with those type of situations?
Yeah, I think just providing, like obviously keeping, like basic, like respectful communication and respecting people's time also I think is important in that arena, because if you are demonstrating that you care about getting them accurate information, then I think it's easier to swallow like anything that kind of contradicts your initial expectations. So just making sure that things are presented in the most like clear, understandable, digestible way that like people understand that like you're not just like throwing data at them and saying like you're wrong, giving like really concrete evidence for stuff. And I think like that also comes from like having a strong leader who is like ready to sort of accept different conclusions based on objective evidence. I would imagine product managers run into that a lot because they're sort of coordinating different perspectives. And I think having people who are leading whatever the initiative is that is being investigated, I think having them ready to be objective and ready to be proved wrong, and then to sort of pivot and adapt if there's a different direction that you have to go in. I think that is really important. So yeah, I think it's kind of a two-way street in that regard.
It's super interesting because I think, being product folks in startups, a lot of the decisions that we have to make are, made based on like very little quantitative evidence, mostly qualitative. And in a lot of cases, we're kind of, creating and confirming our own hypotheses just based on a handful of conversations. That's like, kind of we boil it down to the fact that we're trying to move quickly. But, I could definitely find it, difficult as a product person, and even, while helpful, it's still frustrating when you have an idea, you have an hypothesis, you kind of have a conclusion in your head, but you just can't validate it based on the data available. And it's like, that's the goal, is to be able to make those data validated decisions. But I guess being able to understand when that's not the case and kind of just swallow that pill and move along is got to be a difficult thing to do as a product person.
I think that is a big thing with as you're growing a product, I guess. I'm sure like a ton of different things come to light that you should like even be collecting data on, because that like continues to exist with a pretty established product. like GrubHub, like just knowing what you need feedback on and knowing what sort of user behavior would be useful to track, stuff like that. I think that's very much like an evolutionary process that definitely comes like over time. So even if, you know, like you're basing your current expectations or conclusions on more qualitative than quantitative, I think that like even if it doesn't lead in the direction that you're going, can at least speak to more data that might be helpful for you.
You brought up a good point where it's like even mature products have new data structures coming down the pipeline as more stuff gets built out. How have you, like, what's your experience with that in terms of GrubHub? Like when you're the data analyst trying to generate these reports and all of a sudden you're in the database and there's like all of this new stuff in there that you may or may not have known about that just kind of was released by the product team or the engineering team. And all of a sudden you have to kind of figure out how that data is structured and kind of do your job to produce these reports and metrics.
Yeah, definitely throws a wrench in the gears for like time sensitive projects. I think that's another thing with working cross-functionally is like as much of a heads up as you can give people is obviously the best case scenario. Like if you can kind of give people an idea of what's happening ahead of time. So if I'm in a time sensitive situation, that's obviously very stressful and you sort of just like, you know, you work it out, you get through it, you get it done. But I think if it's, you know, a little less urgent and I have a little bit more time to sort of explore what's going on, that is kind of like my favorite part of my job is like recognizing that there are new parts of the platform that I get to explore and solve problems for. And there's maybe like new insights that can be gained from data that I've like been hoping that we had access to and now we suddenly do, or we're offering like a new feature that is super helpful for something that I'm doing. So I think like as long as it's not like on a tight deadline, I normally am very receptive to having to sort of explore different changes to our data.
You mentioned that you were like a shared resource to generate reports for like other folks who are asking you for that. On this most recent topic of when there's new parts of the platform, are you ever like taking like a proactive approach to kind of generate some reports that you think may be helpful for some teams, like just because you know there's this new data structure or there's this new feature came out and you're thinking, hey, this actually, I have like this hunch to myself that if I look at the data this way, I may actually have some good insights for the marketing or sales team to run off of.
Yeah, I think it's normally less like creating a whole new report. It'll be sort of iterating on something that's existing. So if I know that there's been a change to the platform that is going to affect how like a certain campaign is received or something, definitely sort of like diving into that and making sure that I can proactively sort of build that into whatever I'm reporting on. But I think it's normally sort of like iterating on something that already exists.
So kind of bringing things back around to, you know, product folks, since I think that's the majority of our audience. I'm curious your thoughts on, you know, how the everyday PM at a company that doesn't have an amazing resource like you to run these reports and help you find the answers that you're looking for. What are some kind of like beginner steps that these folks can take to start to kind of find the evidence or, you know, find data that they can easily run and make sense of?
Yeah, I think so basically a database is going to be how most people are interacting with like any sort of data, whether it's like user feedback or sort of engagement metrics or anything like that. So I think being comfortable interacting with a database with whatever resources are available to you. So there's a lot of really good tools that I have been able to use that like data visualization tools that don't require you to be proficient in SQL. They're sort of more of like a drag and drop method. If you like have the time and feel like really digging into a new skill, which I think is great, taking a course on SQL would definitely be helpful, but I think that there are enough existing tools. Like we used Tread.io for a really long time, SciSense or Periscope, Looker is another one. Basically, there's like I think companies are solving for this problem of being able to access data without like having this sort of barrier to entry of knowing like a coding language. And I think getting familiar with any of those tools is a really good first step, because it will still get you thinking in the way that a database works, I guess. Like when I first started learning SQL, I had only had experience with Microsoft Access, which is
I remember those days in college.
It was part of like an intro like CS course that was like required for my combined major, which was actually the most useful course that I took. But Access like didn't involve me coding out anything, but it got me understanding like aggregating and filtering and sort of like moving data around to be in a way that was useful for me. And that was it ended up being a really good jumping off point for my first co-op to learn SQL, because I was like, oh, like I know like I need to group by these things if I'm aggregating this. So I think any experience with like an interactive sort of like visualization platform is like a really good way to go about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so my last company, the extent of my involvement with databases, or we use this tool called Mode Analytics with and I'm sure you're familiar, and you could basically write queries, but I learned the basics of being able to write a couple queries, but then it required that you had a deep understanding of the like databases nomenclature and like understanding how everything is written, and basically it's like its own library that you have to learn, and that made me go through the rabbit hole of understanding database architecture to a big. So I think it's super valuable. I did try getting into SQL, wasn't successful. I was able to get around it, but I think the time will tell that whether or not I need to dive into that. I think the kids in high school nowadays are writing SQL, so I can't. My days are numbered if I don't figure it out.
I think you brought up a good point there, Jonas, of like understanding how the database works and like where certain things are. Question for you, Lilli. When I would say that all product teams or organizations have keeping track of data and doing these reports, data analysis, and getting the quantitative data top of mind or at all. And so they're kind of just trying to move quick and push features out there, and they're kind of ignoring that part of the analysis when building product. What are some tips for you like on how to get started with that? So say you have X amount of features in the platform and there's no really good way to kind of dig into the data to see what's going on in terms of like adoption or usage of your platform. Like what are some key areas you think are good to start off to start tracking those metrics?
Tracking them as in collecting the data, or the data exists somewhere and it's just like a matter of like viewing it?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think if the data exists somewhere, I have been learning a lot about Tableau recently, and I think that's also like kind of a whole thing in itself to learn, but you can really like import just like a big Excel document and then like explore from there with trying to visualize stuff. And there's sort of like an initial learning curve, but I think if like accessing and pulling data in a way that is useful is not like a like built-in tool somewhere, like if you don't have like a Looker mode set up, I think getting your hands on like a big CSV or Excel doc or even a Google doc, like that's what's kind of cool about Tableau. This is not an ad for Tableau. But,
are you an influencer?
I am not. It's decidedly not. But having, you can connect a lot of different data sources. And I think that that can be good if you're in early stages of collecting and analyzing data. Like you might not have like a really built out database. You might just have sort of one-off like exports from wherever you're pulling data from. And that can be really helpful in that like you can connect any kind of like random Excel doc or CSV. And then once you have that, there's definitely like a lot of sort of nuances to the software that like are helpful to formally learn, which is what I'm doing now. But I think that that is probably the most like accessible way to get at data if you don't have like a built-in like visualization tool.
So if you were to say you were to join a startup that had like none of this process or structure foundation in place, is that kind of where you would start, is just trying to get a raw CSV to kind of just poke around yourself and to see what's going on and what the team may need to add in order to kind of enhance some of the data reporting you'd like to do to present to the team?
Yeah, I think if I had the time and the resources, I would look into starting like a small database. Basically just like whatever core metrics you have access to, getting those into a table somewhere. Because that just makes it a lot more dynamic to sort of keep tabs on. Yeah, I think any kind of data exploration you can do in a way that is like organized and allows you to like visualize things in different ways and sort of keep an eye on what metrics might be like the most impactful for you. I think like something like Tableau or like a very simple like intro level database table would be good.
And for companies who are deciding whether or not they need a data analyst, what are some things that you look at and kind of like the structure of a company, whether or not they are, they should have somebody like you that's running reports, helping with business intelligence? Are there some, specific variables that are at play where, if you're, B2C, direct to consumer, then, financial analysis is essential to your business?
Yeah, I think everyone should have someone like me.
I agree. We can't all afford you.
But I think genuinely having someone specialized in working with your data is like pretty critical if it's not like already a part of your team. I think every major product is collecting some kind of data on like their sales or their targets or their user interactions and stuff. And I think having access to information is always going to be useful. I really don't think that there's like any sort of company or organization that wouldn't benefit from having someone who knows how to work with
maybe
data.
Not the type of company, but at what stage of company?
Okay. I would say earliest, honestly, because I think in like very early stages also, like you kind of need to know where data is coming from. Maybe if you're in a position where you're not collecting any data yet, that would make sense to not necessarily have someone specialized in looking for data. But if you're storing any kind of like information about your sales or any metrics for whatever your product is, I think it's useful to have someone who is dedicated to working with that, because in an analytical role, you're sort of like presenting conclusions and drawing conclusions based on whatever the evidence is, right? And you're presenting a point of view. But that is always going to be in collaboration with someone who's making decisions either about product or about marketing or sales. And I think that the expertise involved for those positions like should be sort of applied to like the handoff of data. Like you shouldn't have to be digging into tables if you're worrying about, building lead lists and stuff. Like if you're trying to, build out a ton of different campaigns, like it doesn't make sense for you to be spending time digging through databases when there's people like me who genuinely enjoy doing that. So I do think that if there's any sort of significant like volume of data that you have access to, it's worthwhile to have someone dedicated to looking at that data.
In hindsight, what I hear is always hire people like Lilli, and especially just hire Lilli as soon as you can.
Just hire Lilli. Yeah.
Just hire me. No, I love my job.
And we don't want to get you in trouble.
Yeah.
Before we sign off, I have to ask, do you get any GrubHub deals or inside exclusives or anything like that?
Oh, yeah. Get like a fun dinner once a week, and that's great. When we were back in the before times when we were in an office, you know, I could get a $10 salad every day, and that was awesome. And then we also have a subscription service that gets you free delivery, GrubHub Plus free delivery at various restaurants. And during the rollout of that, we actually, as employees, all got GrubHub Plus for a year. So in addition to some credit, we also got free delivery at our favorite places. So lots of incentive to interact with the product, lots of incentive to give feedback on the product. Like if you have bad experiences, like it definitely works in favor of like developing the product, but mostly in favor of getting me burritos.
It's so cool.
Yeah.
It's so cool to like work at a company with the product that you use. Like in our case, you know, we're product folks. We use Parlor internally, but it's not nearly as cool. Like getting access to Parlor is not nearly as cool as getting free meals. So shout out to you. Shout out to GrubHub.
Shout out to GrubHub.
And you know, just thank you so much for coming on and sharing all this free game. I learned a lot. I recognize that I gotta take Udemy SQL course that I keep getting reminder emails about. I gotta log back in. I gotta log back in there. Actually, it's Code Academy. I lied.
Okay, regardless. That's awesome.
Well,
thank you for having me.
Yes, of course. Thank you. Well, if you ever want to give us more free game and school us on the knowledge of SQL, we probably will be reaching out in the future. But before we forget and before Casey yells at us, just make sure our listeners out there like and subscribe to the podcast, and we'll see everybody back next week. Thank you again, Lilli.